Stepmom said, families share money. That night, my bank alerted unauthorized access. My patience snapped. It was war. Families share money, my stepmom purred one night. The next morning, my bank flagged unauthorized access to my account. That was it. I was done being polite. I stared my father down across the kitchen table and unleashed years of silent fury. If I hear one more word from your wife about my money, I told him, my voice dangerously calm, there will be no more nice chats. I will personally explain exactly where she stands and why my money isn't hers. The silence that followed was deafening. The only sound was the fridge humming, and my stepmother's coffee cup frozen halfway to her lips. My father looked at me like I was a stranger. That was the moment everything changed. I used to think families broke apart with shouting matches, slamming doors, and dramatic scenes that the neighbors would gossip about. I never realized they could just slowly unravel. One polite smile at a time. One delicate comment slipped under the table like a knife. My mom died when I was 14. Cancer. It was fast, aggressive, unforgiving. One summer, she had a dull ache in her side. By late fall, I was standing at her grave in borrowed black shoes that pinched my heels, being told how strong I was. God, I hated that word. Strong meant you couldn't fall apart. My father waited less than a year before he introduced us to Margaret Hale. She wasn't openly cruel, and that was the real problem. She smiled too much. Her whispers were always soft, and she'd caress my arm while she talked to me, like we were already intimately connected. She baked casseroles for the neighbors, poured wine at dinner parties. Everyone liked her. Everyone said my father was so lucky to have found happiness again. I was 18 by then, old enough to know better, but still young enough to just keep quiet. When I left for basic training 3 years later, my dad hugged me so tight, telling me how proud he was. Margaret Hale. She cried just enough to look supportive, but not enough to smudge her mascara. We'll take care of everything here, she explained, her hand resting on my father's back. You just focus on your future. And maybe I needed to trust her because I did. The military taught me discipline, patience, and control. It taught me to listen more than I spoke, to read a room, to be patient. Those lessons, they truly rescued me later, even if I didn't realize it at the time. The first real jab about my money came during my 3rd year of duty. It was a video call. Margaret Hale was right there, sitting next to my father on the couch, her hand resting just so on his knee, like she needed to stake her claim for the world to see. You must be doing so well now, she remarked, a little smile playing on her lips. With your pay, your housing allowance, all those bonuses. I just laughed it off. I manage, I said. Well, she added, her voice sugary sweet. It's good to know the family has security. I remember a cold, knot tightening in my gut. I didn't like the way she said family. The remarks, they just kept coming. Always framed as a worry, always so polite. Have you considered long-term planning? She'd ask. Wouldn't it be easier if your father helped you manage things while you're so young? Money can be so overwhelming. And my father? He'd just nod gently, eyes always carefully avoiding mine. When I came home on leave, I started noticing things. Little things at first. My mother's old desk, the one where she used to sort bills and write letters, was gone, replaced by this sleek, cold glass table. Margaret Hale said it made the room feel cleaner. My mom's old file cabinet, which held everything from insurance papers to my childhood report cards, vanished. When I asked about it, Margaret just waved her hand. Oh, the old things. We organize them. You don't have to worry about it. And just like that, I worried. Instantly. One evening, after dinner, Margaret Hale brought out dessert and casually dropped it. We should really talk about consolidating accounts, she suggested, her voice light. It just makes sense for families. I laid my fork down, carefully. My accounts are fine, I said. She just grinned, unconcerned. Of course, dear. Just a thought. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the tiny outline on the wall where my mother's calendar used to hang. I felt like a guest in a place that used to be mine. The real breaking point, it didn't come from shouting. It came with papers. I was still on duty when I got an email from my bank. A security alert. Attempted access, wrong verification. I froze. Nobody but me had my information. When I called the bank, they asked if I'd recently allowed anyone to assist with my finances. I hadn't. They then mentioned a query about my father's address. That was when something inside me just hardened. I went home on leave 10 days later. I didn't accuse. I didn't raise my voice. I just watched. Margaret Hale talked more than usual about bills, investments, how expensive it was to keep the house, and how my father deserved to unwind after everything he'd been through. Finally, she just said it. Well, your money is already part of this household. I looked at my father. He didn't correct her. He said nothing. That's when I stood up, walked to the table, and delivered the words that had been brewing in my chest for years. Calmly, clearly, without a shred of rage. If I hear another word from your wife about my money, I told him, locking eyes with him, there will be no more nice chats. I'll explain exactly where she stands and why my money isn't hers. Do you understand? Margaret Hale's smile vanished. My father's face went white. He gave a tiny nod, but I already knew that comprehension wasn't the same as respect, and I had had enough of asking for respect. I didn't expect things to change overnight after that warning. People like Margaret Hale, they don't flee when they're confronted. They adjust. They give you a tighter smile. They wait for a better view. For several weeks, everything was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret Hale stopped mentioning money directly. Instead, she focused on stories. Long, meandering chats about stress, about responsibilities, about how difficult it was to keep everything together while I was away. She never asked for anything directly. She didn't have to. She let the insinuation just linger in the air, like the dampness before a storm. Meanwhile, my father, he just grew smaller. I watched it happen. In the way he deferred to her in discussions, how he'd look at her before answering even the most basic questions. I'd find him mid-sentence, suddenly shifting direction because she shifted in her seat or cleared her throat. It was subtle. Yeah, but once you noticed it, you couldn't unsee it. The military had taught me something vital. Control isn't always achieved through force. Conditioning, that's often the cause. Margaret Hale tried to challenge the barrier again, but not at home. It was at a family gathering. One of those long dinners where distant relatives you barely spoke to appeared, pretending you were closer than you actually were. The kind with too much food, too much wine, and just enough time to bring out old resentments. I was sitting at the table when Margaret Hale laughed softly and told my aunt, well, with her military income, we're very lucky. Not many families have that kind of stability these days. My fork froze halfway to my mouth. I didn't look at Margaret Hale. I looked at my father. He was smiling. She's doing well, he said. That was it. That was the crack. Later that night, I pulled him aside. We stood in the hallway outside my old bedroom, the door closed, muffling the sounds of talking from behind us. I established a boundary, I said gently. She crossed it. She was just talking, he said, rubbing his forehead. You're reading too much into it. I'm reading exactly what's there, I explained. And I'm asking you only once to handle it. He exhaled slowly. You don't realize how complicated things are. That sentence, it explained everything. Complicated usually meant excuses had already been made. A few days later, another alert arrived from the bank. This wasn't an access attempt. This was a request for information about a beneficiary. Someone had inquired about the process for adding an authorized user. I didn't challenge them. I documented everything. Dates, times, statements, feedback, emails, screenshots. I'd learned long ago that emotions dissipate. Records did not. Margaret Hale became bolder after that. She took my silence for capitulation. She started phrasing her statements as jokes. Be careful, she'd say with a giggle, or she'll cut us off. Everyone would laugh. I didn't. One evening, she handed my father a stack of papers on the kitchen counter. These are just estimations, she explained pleasantly. I figured we could look over choices together. I recognized the logo on the main page. My bank. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house breathe, the pipes knocking, the air conditioner turning on and off. I stared at the ceiling, and something settled within me. Not anger anymore, but a chilling clarity. The next morning, I went for a run before dawn. The cold air scorched my lungs, steadying me, grounding me. With each stride, I relived everything I'd seen, everything I'd avoided because it was easier than facing the truth. Margaret Hale didn't refuse aid. She wanted control. And my father? He let her take it. When I got back, Margaret Hale was already dressed, drinking coffee at the counter. She smiled when she saw me, like nothing was wrong. Morning, she chirped. Sleep well. Fine, I said. She tilted her head. You've been quiet lately. I have been listening, I replied. Her smile faltered just for a second. That afternoon I made my first call. Not to my father, not to Margaret Hale. I called the legal aid agency. I didn't give them names at first. I just outlined the facts, hypotheses, possibilities, the person on the other, and listened intently before asking a question that made my stomach knot. Did you approve any of this? No. Then you are right to be concerned. Concerned, not dramatic, not paranoid, validated. By the time I hung up, the shape of what I needed to do was becoming chillingly clear. I wasn't going to argue with Margaret Hale. I wasn't going to plead with my father. And I certainly wasn't going to wait for another border to be crossed. I was going to prepare. Margaret Hale made one last attempt that evening, softly and calculatedly. You know, she added, putting her hand on my arm, we do everything for this family. I met her gaze. My money is not. Her hand dropped. She didn't say anything else. But as I walked away, I felt it. The shift. The knowledge that I wasn't simply pushing back. I was no longer able to be managed. And that, I realized, terrified her more than anything I could say. Because people like Margaret Hale aren't afraid of confrontation. They're terrified of losing their negotiating position. I didn't discover the whole truth all at once. It came in fragments. Little everyday objects that only became hazardous when combined. The first was a letter that wasn't even meant for me. It arrived while I was back at base, forwarded from my father's address. The envelope had been opened, sloppily resealed, and then tossed into the outgoing mail pile as an afterthought. Inside, a note from a credit card firm, thanking my father for his recent request about balance transfers and authorized users. The name on the account? It wasn't his. It was mine. I sat on the edge of my bunk, the paper quivering slightly in my hands. That chilly, unmistakable sensation crept up my spine. Not fear, but recognition. The kind you get when something you suspected finally steps out of the shadows and stares you right in the face. I quickly dialed the number on the letter. The representative spoke calmly, professionally, carefully. She confirmed what I already knew. Someone had used my personal details to obtain account access choices. Not successfully, yet but deliberately. Is there a reason why someone would believe they could achieve that? She asked. I thought of Margaret Hale's touch on my arm, my father's silence, the word family used as a key. No, I responded. There isn't. I secured everything that afternoon. New passwords, security questions, verbal passcodes. I flagged my accounts for increased monitoring. The woman on the call guided me through each step, her voice firm and encouraging. You did the right thing by calling early, she added before hanging up. Early. That term just lingered, because it implied that something worse, far worse, could have happened if I hadn't. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place during my next trip home. I was looking for an old notebook, one where my mother used to keep lists. Nothing too significant, just something to make the place feel a little less strange. I checked the hall closet, then the drawer under the phone. Finally, I opened the tiny cupboard in the study. That's where I found the folder. It wasn't hidden. That was their mistake. It sat on the middle shelf, buried between home guides and tax reports, labeled in precise handwriting as planning. Inside, printed emails, budget drafts, debt predictions, and a list of assets, specifically my assets. My name appeared repeatedly, neatly printed at the top of pages I'd never seen before. Notes in the margins mentioned temporary moves, family use, and eventual consolidation. My throat went dry. I stood there, folder open, listening to the sound of Margaret Hale moving around the kitchen, plates clinking, water running, the everyday music of a house that no longer felt like one. Then a single page silenced me, a handwritten note, folded and tucked behind a spreadsheet. It stated, "She will not say no forever. When she understands responsibility, she'll see it's better this way." There were no signatures. There didn't have to be. I carefully closed the folder, put it back exactly where I found it, and quietly walked out of the study. My hands were steady. My heart was not. Margaret Hale discussed growing costs, inflation, and the unpredictability of the future over dinner that night. She spoke with the practiced cadence of someone laying groundwork, not asking for permission. My father nodded. I watched them both, remembering all the years I'd defended his stillness as kindness. How many times I'd convinced myself he was just weary, grieving, or trying to maintain peace. Peace, I was learning, was incredibly pricey, and I was the one being asked to pay for it. Later that evening, my father knocked on my door. He stood awkwardly, hands in his pockets, eyes fatigued. "Your stepmother mentioned you seemed distant," he mumbled. I didn't welcome him in. "I found the folder," I said. He tensed. "You went through our belongings." I recognized my own name, I explained, referring to arrangements I had not made. He breathed slowly. She was simply thinking forward. "For who?" I asked. "She's worried about the house. About us." "So, what about me?" He looked away. That was my answer. After he left, I perched on the side of the bed and let myself feel it. Not fury, not grief. Just a dull, aching clarity. The realization that my father wasn't being influenced. He was participating. The next morning, I called the fraud department. This time, I didn't use hypotheticals. I described the letters, the questions, the documents, the handwritten notes, the addresses. The tone on the other end changed immediately. "Don't confront them," the agent said. "Continue documenting. We will open a file." A file? It sounded so impersonal, but it held so much weight. By the time I returned to base, I had established a system. I scanned all the documents I found. I photographed the handwritten notes. I preserved emails and documented every conversation, including dates, hours, and exact phrasing. I stored copies in 2 secure locations. I learned about the laws relevant to my accounts, my state, my situation. The military had taught me to prepare for contingencies, and that's exactly what I did. Margaret Hale saw the difference before my father did. "You've been really busy," she replied over the phone, her voice light. "You hardly tell us anything anymore." "I'm focused," I said. "That's good," she remarked. "We all need to do our share." I almost laughed. Instead, I ended the call and recorded her statements in my journal. The final piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly, an email from a loan officer, accidentally forwarded to me instead of my father. A short apology, followed by an attachment, a draft application, collateral details, estimated future income. Mine. That's when I knew. This wasn't excessive. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a strategy. And strategies? They could be dismantled. I didn't get much sleep that night. I lay awake, listening to the familiar sounds of the barracks, the rhythmic breathing around me, the hum of fluorescent lights. I remembered my mother, how meticulous she'd been, how she labeled everything, how she used to say that preparation was a form of love. I finally understood what she meant. By daybreak, the anguish had transformed into a cold, hard resolution. They had interpreted my silence as consent. They assumed my distance indicated stupidity. They were wrong, and they were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. I didn't change my behavior right away. That would have been too obvious. People who assume control, they panic when they detect resistance. And panic? That makes them sloppy. But only if you first make them feel safe. So I remained polite. I answered Margaret Hale's calls. I replied to my father's messages. During video chats, I smiled and discussed work without going into detail. I inquired about the house, their health, all the usual things that made me seem interested, but gave them nothing concrete. Inside, though, I was meticulously building something precise. Every morning before work, I went over my notes, dates, times, statements, the exact language Margaret Hale used when she thought she was being subtle, my father deferring instead of intervening. I treated it like I'd been trained to treat intelligence. Verify, confirm, document. Emotion was ineffective here. Structure, that was everything. I opened a new account with a different bank, one my family had never used. I redirected my deposits. I set up alerts on every existing account. I froze my credit. When the confirmation emails arrived, I saved them in a folder labeled simply Evidence. I contacted legal assistance again, this time with specifics, names, documents, screenshots. The officer didn't interrupt. After I finished, he leaned back in his chair, hands folded. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said calmly. "This is attempted financial exploitation." Hearing it said aloud, it hit me. It removed the final layer of doubt. This wasn't a family conflict. This was misconduct. "What are my options?" I asked. He outlined them clearly. Civil remedies, precautionary measures, and, if necessary, criminal escalation. He emphasized choice and control. "You decide how far this goes," he explained. That night, I called the bank again. Not the general line, but the fraud unit handling my specific case. I asked questions. I learned the procedures, the timelines, which types of documentation were important and which would be ignored. Margaret Hale messaged me while I was on the phone. "Just checking in. Your father has been stressed. We are all worried about you." I saved it. The next step was the most challenging. I had to let them believe it was working. I casually mentioned that doing everything alone was exhausting. I said I was overwhelmed. Margaret Hale heard uncertainty in my voice for the first time. She leaned in immediately. "You don't have to do this on your own," she said gently. "Families share burdens." "I understand," I replied. "I'm just not sure where to start." Her voice grew warmer, almost triumphant. "Your father can help. We both can." That was when I knew. She believed she had one. Over the next few weeks, she pushed carefully. A suggestion here, a form there, a remark about how much easier it would be if everything was centralized. She framed it as support, but the paperwork revealed a different story. Each attempt meticulously recorded in my file. My father avoided my gaze whenever the subject came up. He never stopped her. His silence, that became its own record. I began rehearsing the conversation I knew was coming. Not emotionally, but strategically. What I would and wouldn't say. Where I would pause. Where I would let silence do the work. I deliberately chose the setting. A family dinner. On neutral ground. With witnesses close enough to matter, but not enough to turn it into a full-blown theater production. I didn't want a spectacle. I wanted clarity. Margaret Hale looked stunning that evening. She was always most confident when she felt completely in control. She discussed the future, stability, how proud she was of our girl. Halfway through dessert, she mentioned it. "We've been thinking," she said, looking at my father, "maybe it's time to formalize some things." I set down my spoon. "What things?" I asked. She smiled. "Just precautions, in case something happens." "Whom should I ask?" I pressed. She hesitated, just for a moment. To each of us. I nodded slowly. I have already secured my accounts. Her smile wavered. Oh, yes, I said. And I've spoken with my bank and legal counsel. The table went dead silent. My father's face was ashen. Margaret Hale's eyes became sharper, a glint of steel. Why would you do that? She inquired, her voice light but strained. Because someone attempted to access my finances without my permission, I stated evenly. She laughed softly. That sounds dramatic. It is documented, I replied. Silence. I warned you, I continued, turning to face my father. I set a boundary. He swallowed. It was crossed. We were simply trying to help, he finally managed. You were trying to make a decision for me, I said. There is a difference. Margaret Hale leaned back in her chair, her expression cool, trying to regain control. You are overreacting. No, I replied. I am prepared. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't threaten. I simply told them that the quiet version of myself was no longer present. After dinner, Margaret Hale tried to corner me in the kitchen. You are turning this into something ugly, she hissed. It already was, I said. I just stopped pretending it wasn't. She looked at me, calculating. You think you have power here? I know I do, I replied. That was the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes, because she finally realized what my father didn't. I wasn't bluffing, and I wasn't emotional. I was methodical, and methodical people? They don't stop once they begin. Margaret Hale actually came up with the idea for the next dinner. She presented it as a gesture of reconciliation, which, looking back, should have been my first clue. People who have wronged you rarely seek peace unless they're trying to regain ground. She suggested inviting the extended family, my aunt who I barely spoke to, a cousin who always asked invasive questions, and a few family friends who remembered me as a quiet child and continued to treat me as such. It'll be nice, Margaret Hale said over the phone. An opportunity to reconnect. We're all under a lot of stress lately. She used stress to mean leverage. I consented immediately. It surprised her. I could hear it in the pause before her response, as she quickly recalibrated. Good, she finally said. I'll make your favorite. I didn't correct her. She could never remember what that was. The evening arrived, crisp and cool, the kind of autumn night that filled the house with the aroma of roasted vegetables and cinnamon. Margaret Hale had meticulously set the table, candles perfectly spaced, her fine china laid out like a stage. She wore a cream-colored sweater, making her seem soft and approachable. My father hovered near the sink, drying the same glass repeatedly. The guests arrived in groups, coats and chatter filling the hallway. Hugs and compliments were exchanged. Someone mentioned how proud they were that I was serving my country. Margaret Hale seized the opportunity. She's doing very well, she said cheerfully. We're very grateful. Many families don't have that level of security. There it was again. I caught my father's eye. He looked away. Dinner proceeded slowly. Stories, laughter, the clink of silverware. Margaret Hale effortlessly steered conversations, always circling back to responsibility, planning, and the importance of thinking ahead. I waited. It finally arrived during dessert. My aunt, with a warm smile, asked, Do you intend to serve in the military for the foreseeable future? Perhaps, I replied. I enjoy what I do. Margaret Hale nodded. And with that kind of income, she'll have plenty of options. I set down my fork. What kind of options exist? I asked. She blinked. Well, investing, helping family, ensuring that everyone is taken care of. The table went quiet. Not tense, just curious. I reached into my bag and set a slim envelope on the table between us. Margaret Hale's eyes immediately locked onto it. What is that? She asked, her voice a little too high. A summary, I said. I've recently engaged in some financial activity. My father stiffened. Margaret Hale laughed lightly. Is now really the time? I think it's the perfect time, I replied. I didn't open the envelope. I didn't slide papers across the table. I just let it sit there, closed. Its weight, somehow, heavier than anything inside. My bank has contacted me, I continued calmly. There have been numerous attempts to access my accounts, requests for information, and draft applications, none of which were authorized. The room became very, very still. My aunt looked at us, uncertain. Someone cleared their throat. Margaret Hale quickly interjected. That sounds like a mistake. Banks frequently make errors. Not like this, I replied. Not repeatedly. My father finally spoke. We can discuss this later. I'm comfortable discussing it now, I said, because it's already been discussed publicly. Margaret Hale's jaw tightened. I opened a file, I continued, with the fraud department, and I've sought legal counsel. There it was. The shift. The moment when the air changed. Margaret Hale's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. She took another sip, her smile rigid. This is unnecessary, she stated. We are family. That's precisely why it matters, I responded. Nobody spoke. The candles flickered. I turned to face my father. I warned you. I set a boundary. It was crossed. He looked down at his plate. I'm not accusing anyone tonight, I stated. I am informing you. A professional meeting is planned for the near future. We will discuss what happens next. Margaret Hale leaned back in her chair, her calm slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. You are threatening us. No, I said. I'm providing clarity. The remainder of the dinner passed in a blur. Conversations resumed, forced and awkward. People avoided my gaze. When the guests began to leave, Margaret Hale hugged them tightly, her smile unwavering. Anyone watching would have thought the evening had gone wonderfully. As the last car drove away, Margaret Hale spun on me. You humiliated me, she hissed. I told the truth, I answered. You did this on purpose. Yes. My father stood between us. His shoulders slumped. Can we just calm down? I am calm, I replied. Margaret Hale laughed sharply, brutally. That's the point. You think you've won something. I think you understand now, I said. I told you, and that's enough for tonight. She stared at the envelope, still sitting on the table. What's inside it? You'll see at the meeting. She opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. For the first time since I'd known her, she looked uncertain. That night, I got the best sleep I'd had in months. Because here's the deal with leverage. Once it's exposed, it stops working. And Margaret Hale? She knew it. The meeting was scheduled for 10:30 on a Wednesday. Not at the house. Not at a cafe. Neutral ground. An office with glass walls and neutral art. The kind of place designed to keep emotions from staining the furniture. I chose it deliberately. Emotions blur edges. Paper sharpens them. My father arrived first. He looked older, even, than he had a week earlier. His shoulders were hunched. His tie was knotted too tightly, as if he'd pulled it that way to remind himself he was still in control of something. He gave me a stiff, uncertain nod when I entered. Margaret Hale arrived almost 5 minutes late. She wore a dark blazer and heels that clicked sharply against the floor with each step, announcing her presence like she still believed this was a stage she could command. She smiled at the receptionist, at the framed certificates on the wall, at everyone except me. We sat. The mediator introduced herself, then the attorney I'd retained. Quiet, precise, a woman who spoke only when necessary. I noticed Margaret Hale watching her hands instead of her face. That told me something. Let's begin, the mediator said. I didn't speak first. Margaret Hale did. This is all very dramatic, she said lightly, trying to dismiss it. We're here because of a misunderstanding. My attorney just slid a folder across the table. It's documented, she said. Margaret Hale's smile tightened. The mediator cleared her throat. Perhaps we should start with the facts. So we did. The timeline, the dates, the attempted access, the unauthorized inquiries, the draft applications, the handwritten note. the collateral listing my expected future income. Each item presented calmly, methodically, no accusations, no raised voices, just cold, hard facts. My father stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Margaret Hale shifted in her chair, crossing and uncrossing her legs. "This doesn't prove intent," she said, clutching at straws. "People plan." "Families plan for other people's money?" my attorney asked, her voice flat. Silence. The mediator turned to me. "What outcome are you seeking?" I took a breath. I had rehearsed this. Not the words, but the steadiness. "First," I said, a formal acknowledgement that my finances are mine alone. No shared access. No inquiries. No future planning without my written consent. Margaret Hale opened her mouth, then closed it. "Second," I continued, a signed statement confirming that any prior attempts to access or leverage my accounts were unauthorized. My father flinched. "Third," I said, a commitment that my name, income, and expected future earnings will not be used in any financial discussions, applications, or representations going forward. Margaret Hale leaned forward. "And if we don't agree?" I met her gaze. "Then the fraud file moves forward." The room went very quiet. My father finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "You do that to us?" I looked at him. I already did it to protect myself. He rubbed his face with both hands. "We were just trying to make things easier." "For whom?" I asked. He didn't answer. The mediator interjected gently. "There are alternatives to escalation. Settlement. Boundaries." "That's what I'm offering," I said. Margaret Hale laughed softly, bitterly. "You're enjoying this?" "No," I replied. "I'm ending it." She turned to my father. "You're going to let her do this?" He hesitated. That hesitation, that space where he should have defended me years ago, was all the confirmation I needed. My attorney placed another document on the table. "This outlines the terms," she said. "If signed, no further action will be taken." Margaret Hale scanned the page quickly, her face changing as she read. "This limits us," she said sharply. "It protects me," I replied. "And what about family?" she demanded. "Family doesn't require access to my accounts," I said. She looked at my father again. "Say something." He swallowed. "Margaret Hale, maybe we should just sign." Her head snapped toward him. "After everything I've done for you." The mediator raised a hand. "Let's keep this productive." Margaret Hale leaned back, her composure finally cracking. "You're choosing her over me." My father stared at the table. "I'm choosing to stop this from getting worse." She laughed, then a bitter, sharp sound. "You always do this. You retreat." I watched them, detached, as if observing a pattern finally visible from the outside. "I'm not asking you to choose sides," I said. "I'm drawing a line." The mediator slid the pen across the table. Margaret Hale didn't reach for it. My father did. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking. "If we sign this, what happens?" "The matter ends here," my attorney replied, "provided there are no further violations." Margaret Hale's fingers curled into her palm. "And if we don't?" "Then the documentation is forwarded," I said. She stared at me, really looked at me for the first time without calculation. "You think you're so disciplined," she said quietly. "So controlled." "I am," I replied. "That's why this works." She turned away, jaw tight. My father signed first. The sound of the pen on paper was louder than I expected. Margaret Hale stared at the document for a long moment, then snatched the pen and signed with a sharp, angry stroke. The mediator collected the papers. "Think high," she said. "We'll finalize this." As we stood, my father lingered. "Can we talk?" he asked me quietly. I shook my head. "Not today." Margaret Hale walked past us without a word, her heels echoing down the hallway, each step heavy with something like defeat. Outside, the air was cool and clear. I took a breath and felt something loosen inside me. Not relief, exactly, but completion. I hadn't won. I had concluded. and sometimes that was better. The silence afterward was unfamiliar, not the awkward kind that followed arguments, not the brittle quiet that settled over a room when someone refused to apologize. This was different. It was clean, unoccupied, like a space that had finally been cleared of furniture you never chose in the first place. I returned to base 3 days later. The drive was long, stretching through flat highways and early morning fog. I kept the radio off. I wanted to hear my own thoughts, to test how they sounded now that I wasn't constantly defending myself inside my head. They were quieter. My father sent a short message that week. Just a few words. I hope you're fine. I didn't respond. Not because I was angry. Anger would have required energy I no longer wanted to give. But because the message was incomplete. Hope without accountability was just another form of avoidance. I had spent years filling in gaps for him. I was done doing that. Margaret Hale didn't reach out at all. I learned later, through a relative who still thought updates were helpful, that she was telling people I'd become cold, that the military had changed me, that I'd turned money into something ugly. I let her have that story. People like Margaret Hale, they needed narratives. They needed to be wronged, misunderstood, diminished by forces beyond their control. I didn't need to correct her. Anyone who mattered had already seen enough. What surprised me most was how little I missed the house. I had expected grief, nostalgia, a sense of loss for the place where I'd grown up. But when I really thought about it, the house I missed hadn't existed for a long time. Not since my mother died. Everything after that had been a version edited by someone else. On my next free weekend, I drove to the cemetery. It was quiet, the grass trimmed neatly, the headstones catching the afternoon light. I brought nothing with me. No flowers, no prepared words. I didn't need them. I stood in front of my mother's grave and just told her the truth. I handled it, I said softly. I didn't let them take what wasn't theirs. I thought about the girl I'd been when she died, how desperate I'd been to keep things together, how willing I'd been to disappear, to make space for other people's comfort. I wished I could tell her that it hadn't been weakness, just youth, just love misdirected. I learned how to say no, I said, and how to mean it. The wind moved through the trees, gentle and steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for permission to breathe. Life settled into a new rhythm after that. My finances stayed exactly where they belonged. My name stayed off everything that wasn't mine. The fraud file was closed, marked resolved. The folder labeled evidence went into storage untouched but always available. Not a threat, just a reminder. My father tried one more time, 5 months later. A voicemail. This time he sounded exhausted, older. I should have protected you, he said. I did not. I'm sorry. I listened to it 3 times. Then I archived it. Apologies don't rebuild trust. They acknowledge damage after it's done. I wasn't cruel enough to deny him the chance to reflect. But I wasn't obligated to resume a relationship just because he finally understood the cost of his silence. Some lessons arrive late. That didn't make them my responsibility. The military gave me structure. My mother gave me values. And this experience, unwanted, exhausting, necessary, it gave me something else entirely. Boundaries. Not walls. Not punishments. Just clear lines, drawn with intention. I didn't walk away with satisfaction. There was no victory lap. No dramatic sense of triumph. What I gained was quieter than that. I gained ownership of my life. I gained the understanding that respect didn't require permission, and that being difficult was sometimes just another word for being unwilling to be used. Most of all, I learned that family isn't defined by access. It's defined by care.